Thinking about those things you'd like to ask.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at this exciting moment of forming a new school that you're all involved in. And as Mary said, I'm going to try and, it's not going to work, I'm going to try and give a bit of an overview. I will leave a lot of time, I hope, for questions. And so if I'm not hitting the things that are on your minds, please make sure that we get those questions and we can address them. Just so I have a little bit of a picture of to whom I speak, how many of you are currently parents in a Waldorf school? Thank you. How many of you intend to be parents in this new school? How many of you are teachers or are in education? A lot. Okay. Good. So for some of you, what are some of the things I'm going to start off with in particular may be familiar to you. For others, it may be brand new, but let's again just see how we go. But just in a question of why we're all here tonight with this question, what is Waldorf education? Quite a big topic, potentially. I am assuming that we're here out of interest for either our children or other people's children. That we are looking in some way at this question of education and a school that somehow synchronizes with our values, but not just our values, with our hopes and dreams for our children, either our own children or our children. So I'm making that assumption at the get-go, which by the looks of things I'm seeing heads nodding, that is correct. And when we look at a different path in education, which Waldorf education is. It's a very well established, very well trodden path, but it's different. We're often drawn to that for a couple of reasons, and I imagine those reasons are also in this room. One, we sort of have a feeling of what it is, we know something about it, and it's a choice on that level. Or two, which certainly was my beginning, we're reacting to experience or what we know about what the main part is, and we're looking for something that feels like more of a fit, which is often how many of us start down the alternative path, the path less taken. So whatever the reason, at a certain point, we need to understand a little bit more about what that path is. Because let's face it, sending our children to a school, which is one of the things in our society we just take as an absolute given, is a really big deed of trust. It's a really big deal to hand our children over every day, to pick them up at the end of the day, to hand them over in kindergarten and to pick them up at the end of 12th grade. Yeah? And we have a lot of hopes and expectations and anxiety about that, expressed or unexpressed. So let's all acknowledge that we're in a risk-taking activity, which in this area is probably very appropriate from what I can see. You go out on that wet, slippery stuff all the time. So I think it's also important, one, to acknowledge the worries, not overemphasize them, and make that part of what we address. What are we getting into here in this new venture? And as a parent, is it going to be okay? I think becomes a very important question. Is it all going to work out, or are they going to sit in a room knitting as their career for the rest of their lives? What outcomes can we expect? So that's sort of the tack we'll take a little bit. But I'm actually going to back up even a little bit more with a different question. You're all confronting change right now with a change of your children's school. That's significant. And we all react to change a little bit differently. And a lot of questions will come up as you go through this very exciting process. But before we do that, the question tonight is, what is Waldorf education? And I will come back to that several times. So I promise I'm sort of on the topic. I promise, Mary. But I'd like to take out the word Waldorf for a moment and just ask us for a moment to think about, what is education? And it's not always something we think about. We know we need to send our children to school at a certain point during their toddlerhood. That becomes a really good thing. And we know there's certain capacities and skills they need to develop. But why do we have schools? I mean, these are things worth thinking about when we're starting a new school. Clearly, that's a topic beyond our scope tonight. But one of the things I'd like to focus on is, even in this well into the 21st century now, where we're making a very different use of technology, where we have some very new ideas about how we can do things, education is really a human activity. It's really, when you boil it down, about these children, your children, and the adults who are going to be working to help shape their futures. So education is a very, very important activity for society, for parents. It can be seen many different ways. And one of the things that has happened, I think, and I would argue, in education, not just in this country, is that there has been a bit of a trend to make it into less than a human activity and more about a product. Yeah? So what we're talking about tonight gets away from that and asks us to reshape that picture. Interestingly, we're starting a charter school here. And it is the charter school growth starting in 1991 in this country that really has opened the door for this thing called Waldorf education to go out from a fairly small, protected, independent school world and to become available to many, many more children. And it's grown significantly, first in the number of states in which you see Waldorf education, as in the public sector, and in the number of schools. So something has caught fire. There's something here that is appealing to parents and to children that they're responding to. Of course, charter education in itself is a very interesting thing. It represents some of the core principles of American public education. Open to all children, free, accessible, and the interesting thing, though, is giving parents a choice. So parents are put a little more in the driving seat rather than what's my neighborhood school to what am I looking for my child. And in the charter world, we have this wide range of options that parents are responding to. So let's unpack a little bit about what you might be looking for in the special emphasis of Waldorf education, the special character of a Waldorf school. So what is Waldorf education, our topic? It's actually not as simple as it might seem. And it's a topic that I've spent 25, 30 years actively working with, trying to get some answers. And my answers have changed over that time, and they continue to change. And again, I would say with the growth of charter schools, the questions and the answers are changing again. Because we're being asked as we move into a wider and more public setting to address different questions. So it's very, very important what is happening here. A little bit of history for those who don't know anything about Waldorf education. It's almost 100 years old. Began first with one school in 1919 in Stuttgart in Germany. And who cares, really? Except there are some very important pieces of information in that first school. So if we think in 1919, we have post-war Europe. Terrible, terrible conditions. Food riots, unbelievable inflation, people hungry, unemployment, people against one another. Society felt as if it was completely disintegrating. And in the middle of that, we had a factory. Interestingly, if you don't know where the name Waldorf came from, and how many of you don't, it's a delicious irony. It's the name of a cigarette factory, okay? The Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory. And into this picture came a man, Rudolf Steiner. The schools are called Steiner schools in a lot of the world, and Waldorf schools in a lot of the world, and sometimes they're called Waldorf Steiner schools or Steiner Waldorf schools. He was an Austrian philosopher, a spiritual scientist, wrote and gave a lot of information on a huge range of topics, including biodynamic agriculture, architecture, art, medicine, this huge body of work. And in 1909 or 1906, he had written a little book on education, suggesting that we needed to think about the education of children very, very differently. But he didn't do anything with it. Because just like this school starting here, the work didn't start until there was a question, until someone asked to have a need met. And so we had the cigarette factory owner who decided in these terrible post-war conditions he wanted education for his workers. And he knew Rudolf Steiner and invited him in to do a series of lectures for the workers. And very quickly they all said what any parent would say, what you're all here for tonight: we want something for our children because we want a better future for our children. We need options for our children. How do we make the world better out of these terrible conditions? It's only really going to be through a different education. And that has been the motive of Waldorf education for almost 100 years. How can we develop the skills and abilities in children so that we can have a more promising future? And so they began the school in the factory for children. And it became enormously popular. But from the beginning it had this almost revolutionary aim of positively impacting society. How do we do that? We develop capacities in the children. We know that if we are going to change society, and these are very, very modern ideas, we need creative problem solving. We need imagination. We need a sense of moral responsibility. We need the capacity to think and stand independently in the world. They are all described as 21st century skills needed for the workplace. And these were the skills that were and are at the basis of Waldorf education. How do we bring children into schools, and how do we work with them in a way that we can help them develop their innate capacities? So teachers then almost become midwives, helping children develop skills that are latent within them. And along with that was this question of freedom. How do we help to develop, and I think this is again something we want for our children, how do we help them? If you think of those of us who've been lucky enough or are lucky enough to parent teenagers, how do we help them through those kind of passages with a sense of self and an ability to stand and think independently in the world? And Steiner says it's education. It's a particular form of education, a particular form of quality of education that will allow that thinking. And then we start to flip everything around. So moral responsibility, creativity, problem solving, independence, etc., are the core goals of Waldorf education. But again, as you enter into this new venture, I think it's important to have another picture of this first school. Because as I said, a lot of the seeds, I watched second grade gardening today, so a lot of the seeds of Waldorf education were put in place right at the beginning from that philosophy. The interesting thing about him was he was a realist. He was very much a man of the world and a man of his time, intensely interested in the world around him and how do we meet the problems. So he was very, very clear that a school is a social institution and it has accountability. And that shows itself to different ways. First and foremost, it has accountability to the children. And I would suggest that that's something we've forgotten in education right now. The experience of the children, the rights of childhood, the space to be a child, but the responsibility towards the children, responsibility to their parents, responsibility to the teachers, so far we're good, responsibility to the district, state, county, whatever it is in terms of accountability. That was there from the very beginning. And how do we navigate that particular dance between freedom and responsibility? You will all be working with that as a charter school. That's one of the things the charter schools have really been helping us to think about. Public education asks for a particular form of accountability in return for funding. Independent schools have a different kind of accountability in return for funding. Both are in this dance, but it's a different dance. But it's there in education. So just to keep that in mind. And we'll return a little bit later to this picture of accountability because I think it's going to be an important one as you navigate how you take this gift of Waldorf education. In my opinion, I'm totally biased. I should have said that at the beginning. You are not getting an independent speaker here. I've been committed to this for a very long time. But how do we take it into this different setting? So then again, even though this will be repeat work for some of you, let's just look at a few key principles of this. Again, what is Waldorf education? Many of them present in the first school, many instantly recognizable whenever you walk into a Waldorf school, and many reflecting Steiner's work with the first teachers. He gave them a crash training course in about 2 weeks, but that was an unusual situation. So I'm going to throw out a few principles, and I'm aware that they may need some more explaining, but let's just paint the picture. First of all, he talked about education as an art. And that doesn't actually mean that we're all skipping around and dancing all the time. That's a separate principle. But that there is an artistry in education, in how we teach, in how we form a school, in how we work together as adults. It's an art form, a social art form. So education as an art, not necessarily a picture we always apply to education as we understand it right now. Then he also talked about education and the arts. So in Waldorf education, as I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of emphasis on the children being engaged hands-on in the arts of various forms. The wonderful thing now is, starting in about the 1980s, there's a huge body of work out of academia that really shows the lessons that the arts teach. That they really show how we develop creative thinking, how we develop problem solving, how we develop autonomy, how we develop a sense of judgment out of this use of the arts. And yet, when we're in a budget crunch in education, normally, what is the first thing to go? Art. Because it's looked at as an add-on, a non-essential. The interesting thing about Waldorf education, those of you who know it or are coming to know it, it's not negotiable, because you can't pull it out and have the whole left. It's woven in. It's part of the fabric of this thing we call education. So our children are repeatedly getting this rich, deep education through the arts. So the arts are very, very important. The next key principle that we really see, and again that has sort of been forgotten, put by the wayside a little bit in education, is again so obvious to us if we've ever been a parent or around children. Children develop. And the way of relating to the world of a young child is very different than a 12-year-old, than a 14-year-old, certainly than a 16 or an 18-year-old. So we're all on this developmental journey as human beings. And education needs to relate to that. It sounds very sensible, but it's not often a principle in schools, particularly anymore. So if we decide that children are at different stages of development, and that different stages of development have different needs, we need to approach education very, very differently at the different stages. They're not little adults. And we see this interestingly right now with the new Common Core federal standards, where if you look at very commendable in their goals, some very, very interesting things are coming out of them, but they basically say, okay, the purpose of the Common Core is to make sure that our young, just to be very clear, our young people are college or career ready. Of course we want that, but is that all we want? Is really the question that needs to be in the debate and gets forgotten. So college and career ready. So if I know at 12th grade my students need to know this, I need to trace that all the way down to kindergarten and be able to recognize it there. Yeah? Instead of asking what capacities do I need to develop here in order to get there. So one's goes top down. Waldorf education argues that you actually grow from the ground up, and that you build capacities at the right time. And in order to do that, you have to trust human development. You actually have to trust, not just sit back and say, oh, they can do whatever they like, because that's absolutely not what's going on. But that right time, right diet, will result in right outcome. So it's a radical switch in how we often think about schooling. So our kindergarten children enter a world in Waldorf education that is pre-academic. And what do we have them do? It looks like they're kind of having a good time. We can't have that. Where are the desks? Where are the pencils? Where are the worksheets? What's with all this cloth and these random toys? What are they doing outside digging? And yet when we look at the intelligence of that Waldorf kindergarten experience for children under the age of 7, and we look at the capacities that are being developed in all of the intelligences, social, emotional, tactile, nature, this whole range of intelligences, we start to go, aha. Plus, it feels good. And isn't it okay for education to feel good? That you walk into a space that feels nurturing? So we recognize that this educational developmental process is going to take time. And we say, we're fine with taking time. We have confidence that the outcomes will be what we need them to be. So there's a trust in this arc of human development that is woven into Waldorf education. What we teach, how we teach it, needs to be based on this time principle. And we need to respond to the developmental need of the child. And there's no hurry. The picture is often described in 7-year phases of development. So we have the young child up to around the age of 7. And if we go all the way back to ancient Greece, it's always been recognized as a stage of development. And so there's a particular set of developmental tasks we want them to be really, really solid in. And if you compare a newborn to a 7-year-old, we see immediately what those tasks are when you think of the extraordinary development that happens. If it continued, we would be a race of oddly shaped giants. Yeah? You know? If you took that growth of the first 18 months to 2 years, just think what we'd look like. Huge heads, little arms, no necks. All of these things happen, and our children learn to be upright, they learn to walk, they learn to talk. All of these processes need appropriate attention. So our young children need to be protected. There's plenty of time for a fast-paced world. They need creativity. They need to know they're safe. And they need to work in the kinds of things that once upon a time people did at home or on the farm. Because there's a wisdom in all of that body work that will show up later. So we give them time with these wonderful goddesses called kindergarten teachers who have a lot more patience than I do, who can really work with creating and holding this space for them. The phases, by the way, overlap. A child doesn't wake up one morning on the 7th birthday and they're suddenly in another phase. So we see echoes and a foretelling of what will come. But then our second 7-year phase, and again, think of how we have our schools organized, 7 to around 14, it's a whole different principle going on. And now we can really see the children as artists. They have this wonderful imagination. They love stories. They think in pictures until around 11 and a half, 12. And that's their primary diet. So we can teach all of those academics through this world of imagination and art. It's not that they're not doing academics, they're actually doing very rigorous academics. It's a question of how and when. So they enter into this wonderful world of imagination. And during those first 7 years, we really want to instill in them this idea that life is good, that they're safe, that the world is good. Funnily, they find that experience even in very, very damaged situations. There's a desire of the young child to trust life. In the second stage, we want them to live as long as possible with this attitude, life is beautiful. We're on this earth, it's beautiful. Here are my friends, here am I, and it's all an adventure. So we foster that through relationship, through stories, through a curriculum that we can talk about a little bit more if we have time, that really mirrors what's happening with them developmentally. So as a class teacher, you have this gift that you bring a new curriculum and you meet them exactly where they are. It solves a lot of the management issues in education if you have the children's interest. I mean, it seems so basic, right? So basic. Then the third phase, our wonderful teenagers, And this one has started to come down a little bit, and yet not really. 14 to about 21, and we throw them out of the educational nest before they're done with this one, is really now that they are starting to test their independent thinking. And they want to find out about truth. So we want in them this attitude of life is true. And around the age 12 and a half, 13, 14, they're getting really interested in what you know and whether you can stand in your knowledge as a teacher. So this developmental journey, and of course within this, every child has their own unique developmental path. So we need to be taking them all on this collective developmental journey that in some ways is a developmental journey of history. But at the same time, we need to be working with every single individual child who will be at various points along this journey. So there's a whole and a parts going on there. So life is good, life is beautiful, life is true. And through that, we have this curriculum that weaves in and out and really tells two big stories. One is the story of the human being. So they go all the way from before time and place of fairy tales right into the modern time to today. And the other is the story of the book of nature. So they start, and I'm talking grades, not kindergarten. All of this is actually in many ways done in the kindergarten. They start with just the daily rhythm, their very home surroundings, and they will go all the way out actually into space and into the core of the earth and the geography of the earth. So they'll go through the kingdoms of nature, they'll do sciences, these two journeys that weave again and again, that are first brought through imagination and pictures and end up as concept, fact, and then when they go into kindergarten, they figure out how this is all constructed. Into kindergarten, that's interesting. They do actually, into high school. They've already done that in kindergarten. So, interesting. So, and then we say, well, okay, if we have these 7-year phases, the child really does relate to the world differently, and we know this if we're around children. And think of the effort we all put in with a baby into getting a smile out of a baby of a certain age. We're willing to make ourselves complete idiots, right, to get that response. Yeah? Because, and then, you know, what are those early words going to be? And one of them had better be mama. You know, I'm up every night. It had better be early on there. And so we mirror for them. A basic principle of learning. Young children learn through imitation. If we sit in the kindergarten and watch, the teacher starts to do something, the children can't help themselves. They want to do it. So we have this incredible power of imitative learning with the young children that our kindergarten friends use. Second phase of development, they really do learn through their imagination. So we tell a lot of stories in the grades. You can give an enormous amount of information in a very lively way through stories. And then in the third phase, they really are learning through their thinking, their independent thought, and coming to judgment. Not always, if you're around a 16-year-old, not always judgment, not always good judgment anyway, but they're working towards this capacity of independence in judgment and thinking. Another core principle, we say the human being is more than just physical. And this was one of the interesting questions when Waldorf began to move into public schools at first. What could you say? What couldn't you say? Could you talk about a child being more than physical? Could you have this imagination from the poets of trailing clouds of glory, here she comes, for an infant? Could you have an idea that we are more than just our physical body, that we have other capacities? This one's a little more tricky. And yet, if we look at what's happened in the media, in movies, in culture, it's become a much more accepted idea, a much more contemporary idea. And it certainly resonates with most parents where you have that, who are you? Experience with a young child. Who are you and what are you here to do? And they're really the key questions for the teacher. Who are you? Can I understand you? Can I support you? And how can I help you for what you're intended to do? How can I help you on the way? Really, that's the purpose of education, I would argue. to help unlock the mystery, the wonderful little package that is a child. Let's unwrap it and help it on its way. Another principle, Waldorf education is holistic. And that's a word that can be overused. So let's make sure we know what it means. It says that we don't just learn through our heads. We don't want to be just little talking heads. We don't just learn through our limbs. And we don't just learn through our feelings. But as human beings, we need to have hand, head, and heart engaged in the learning process. And the emphasis, of course, from this picture of human development will be different at different points. But we want them all engaged. We want to work with the whole child, so it's holistic. And it also is holistic in how it makes connections between subjects. We don't just divide them all up because the world is interconnected. It's also a word that is, again, not so popular in education right now. It talks about moral education. The ability to be ethical in our relationships with ourselves, with one another, and with the earth. Moral responsibility. And with the youngest children, you know, we use our words, not our hands. We're modeled to. We teach a lot of lessons of how to be human beings through the story curriculum, where they get over and over again these different imaginations of how do we resolve problems as human beings? How do we develop standards so that when they are that 16-year-old faced with a real moral dilemma, they have a bank of information to draw on. They have some substance that we've helped plant in them that grows and becomes their own. So we want them to be responsible human beings. We want to be addressing their social, emotional education as well as their intellectual education. Another principle, I said earlier that education is this essentially human activity. Waldorf education is based on relationships. A lot of work is put into the social fabric of a class because we're going to have to get along. Even though we have now entered a new phase of parallel play, which is something the very young children do. If you walk into any Starbucks, you will see adults and adolescents engaged in parallel play. Sitting side by side, right? So we have some new social challenges and opportunities. But we say, okay, this is a relationship-based education, and we know that relationships need time. So we make sure there is time for that over a period of years and time in the day. Time is actually an important factor in Waldorf education. One, this developmental time. Two, making sure our relationships go over time. And three, most Waldorf schools build a community so that families also have this sense of relationship over time, really important in our modern age, when that has broken down for a lot of us. Another really important thing that again sounds so simple and yet I think has become a forgotten principle in education is one that I love: teachers matter. And again, if we look at what have been some of the trends in education, it's sort of been to foolproof it, to teacher-proof it. You know, if we standardize enough and we instruct the teachers enough and we restrict it enough, we'll get good outcomes. And teachers really feel this, if you work with teachers, because they have wonderful intuitions and knowledge of children. And yet somehow what is said coming out of an office somewhere overrides that. So teachers matter. And teachers need to be learners. And so professional development is another core principle of Waldorf education, where we want the children to see that we also are on a learning journey. And often a teacher will take a class for a good number of years, up to 8. It's not a requirement, but it's certainly a characteristic. I can guarantee you that if you have a group of children for even 3 years, they're going to witness you as a learner. They're going to witness their teacher having to encounter something that is difficult. What a gift for a child. I am willing to do this for you, for your learning. I'm on this journey with you. Yes, I'm the adult, absolutely, but we are learning as human beings and it never stops. Another principle I've mentioned, this principle, the importance of story for us as human beings. Daniel Pink, who's done a lot of work on 21st century learning, says this is one of the core principles for 21st century learning: story and imagination. Yes. And another one, aesthetics matter. That actually the surroundings in which we place our children every day for hours have an impact on them. So let's be thoughtful about our environment. And again, you now have this opportunity with creating a school. What do we want it to feel like? It's not always something that's discussed, and there's very little research on the impact of physical environment on children. What there is there shows that it matters. So we want our school to feel like a welcoming, warm, accepting place. And that's actually right there in the aesthetics. Another principle, a very important one in this century, possibly much less important here: nature, and making sure that children maintain a connection with nature as an educator. There's a whole school of thought now, of study, called nature deficit disorder, where children are disconnected from the wisdom of millennia of nature. So can we help our children to maintain a living connection with the earth, with the seasons, with the rhythms of the year, so that they feel grounded as human beings? And form and structure. Often when we say Waldorf education, people who don't know anything different say, oh, that's that free school, isn't it? Where they can do whatever they like and they play all day and they, that's absolutely not what Waldorf education is. It's actually very structured. But that the children can look to adults to create that structure, which of course gradually changes over time. And that within that rhythm is a very important organizing principle, especially for the young children. So there's a predictability for the children, which actually means they can relax. As adults, we think it might be the opposite. But we provide the structure, they can just be within the structure. And rhythm, I will tell you, is the teacher's and the parent's best friend. It solves so many issues of what are we going to do, what are we going to have for dinner, what do you want to wear, if there's a rhythm that will carry the children. And the children do relax. Again, changes when they're adolescents, when they have different needs. But for the children in the kindergarten and the grades, they need this feeling that we as adults are willing to be in charge. A little countercultural in our modern society. But we're the adults and we're willing to be. There's an emphasis on movement, another principle. I mentioned earlier, our worry as parents that they will end up with a great career in knitting. But there is a very good reason for why they knit, because it has all sorts of brain activity. Left, right, up, down, following directions, repetition, crossing the midline, all of these neurological patterns that are in this simple ancient activity of knitting. And of course, the children love it. So prepare yourselves for hand-knitted objects, because they will come. And we could do a press release on knitting as a basis for higher thinking, because it's all right there, and the kneading of the bread in the kindergarten, all of these different activities, the wisdom of the body. And making sure that those capacities are as strongly developed as possible so that we can be ready for higher learning, for technology, for all of the things that will come that we need to have capacities for. So really strong foundation, movement all the way through. And then one final principle that I think again is really important to parents with this risky activity of sending our children off to school on a daily basis for much of the year is protection. That we need to be able to feel in an overly busy and pressured world that there is a place of safety and protection for our children. That we need to trust the adults to whom we give them over every day. And that we all together actually need to be in defense of childhood. Protecting childhood. They need a place where they can be children. Sometimes school is the only place, not always. But sometimes. So can we provide a school that protects childhood And in the context of our really busy, hurried world where we're all dealing with a certain level of stress, that is really important. So, let's get to the knitting question as a career. Because as you are going to put your children, or have put your children in a Waldorf school, we have to be responsible. And we do need to know that they're going to be okay. And I shared this a little bit talking to some of the teachers last night. I've been a Waldorf teacher and educator for over a quarter of a century. My two children went all the way through, and yes, I don't even know whether they can remember how to knit, but they are both out in the world. I had moments when I thought, what am I doing? And so I think for all of us as a community to be able to support one another with those what am I doing moments. And really underlying the what am I doing is often, is this going to work out okay? Because I can't go back and do it again. I'm not going to send my child off to school for the first time again. So this, is it going to be okay, is important. And then we hear the, oh, well, they don't do academics in those schools, do they? Or, you mean she can't read yet? With a voice that's dripping in judgment. I remember taking my 5-year-old, or 5, it might have even been 6, to a pediatrician in Manhattan. And they pulled out the eye chart and he said, I can't read. And they looked at me as if I was potentially a child abuser. But this was Manhattan. But how do we understand enough and have enough confidence that it is going to be more than okay? It's going to be more than okay. One, there's some research that helps us, and I think we need to know this, that actually there's a very extensive study of alumni in this country, but we need to look further than that because it comes out of independent schools. It's great research. 95%, 96% go to college. 84% of those who go to college finish college. That's a very high number. Many of 42% or something of those go into the math and science fields. Funnily, many of our alums are found in technology and media. Just as an interesting picture. What is that? But we need to look further than that. There are also studies in Sweden, in Brazil, in Germany and in England that show certain characteristics in Waldorf graduates. What are they? One, yes, they do. Many of them do go on to college. Some of them do become artists. Some of them become starving artists. You would hope some of those would be in there if we're really saying we're helping you to become who you are meant to be. Some of them become very successful. We want those ones to come back and help us all. But some of the things they find is that there is a sense of self. These are the less tangibles. A self-confidence. They are the ones who raise their hands in the class of 500 at the university. They are the ones who, of course, go to office hours because they are used to the idea that education is based on relationships. So you go to the human being with your questions. So they often become TAs really quickly in a university context. They are often engaged in social causes. And some things they often retain in art form. I didn't notice that with my sons, but I'll go and ask them about it. And they, very important for parents, their families matter to them. So this whole principle of being a social being is there in the adults. But there's this wonderful sense of self that is palpable, that you can see and feel it. And it's showing up again and again in research studies. So we know we've got the basics that are very important in this society. Again, if we think of those Common Core standards, college or career ready. These are really important values in our society. We know that, yes, with a Waldorf education, many of them will go on to college. We also in this society make an assumption that everyone should go to college, which again is not actually a free situation. Many of them, funnily enough, will take a gap year, higher than, almost double the national rate. They go off and do interesting things for a year, many. And again, what is the research showing us right now? That a gap year is a really good idea. for long-term success. For long-term success. A lot of 18-year-olds are simply not quite ready for that leap. So they'll be okay. They'll be okay even if they come in and out of this, which is another question for parents. Well, if I'm walking down this path and my situation changes in 3 years, is my child in trouble at that point? No. They can flow in and out of different educational systems quite fine. Is there a period of adjustment? Yes. Is there a period of adjustment when you go to any new school? Yes. So that is not an impediment. And now, and then I'd like to throw it open to questions, just a couple of things. Again, this accountability question. There is a different accountability in a public setting and an independent setting. And that's going to be a bridge a number of you now walk over. The landscape will be different. The requirements are different. Right now in our system of education in this country, whether we like it or not, and you will hear that I don't, accountability means test results. It has really, really limited our picture of what education is. It's outcomes based. A teacher's worth is based on that, no matter that test results reflect things other than tests. It's narrowed education terribly. It's driven academics way, way down. So a kindergarten is no longer a place of play and childhood. It's now we're looking at whether we could do pre-Ks academically. So what we have done is we've said we are so worried about the outcome, we just think if we start earlier, we're going to be okay. And now we're scratching our heads because it looks as if we're not okay. And now we're doing this grand experiment of the Common Core, really well intentioned. We want all children to have a more creative education. We want them to be thinking more. But it doesn't have this developmental piece in it. It's not there. And it has again narrowed education. And Waldorf education says let's keep it wide and deep and take our way through it. But this is something we're all very busy in research. What do Waldorf charter schools do with the Common Core? They're a reality. And reality needs to be addressed. And what I will say, as I hope helpful, is one, there's no such thing as a pure Waldorf school. Never has been, never will be. Waldorf schools take this picture of the human being and this incredible curriculum, and then they work in a particular time and place, and they need to address the needs of that particular time and place. So they all look a little bit different. And at that very, very first school, one of the compromises they needed to make was that they had to do assessment. And the founder of that school said, this is one of the compromises we need to make, but it's worth it to be here. So you will find your way with that particular interesting question. And here the charters are really leading the way with a new kind of research. How do we be accountable to this in a way that leaves us pretty free? Because that's what we want. We want to be there. So no such thing. It's really important. There's no one fixed picture of Waldorf education. There's no recipe. You can't buy the kit. Well, actually now you can, but it doesn't work very well. It's really this question of a group of adults working on behalf of children to ask what is needed based on what we know about children and education. And the results are wonderful. Then, of course, there's an almost 100-year body of practice. We know certain things work because they've been done over and over again in different countries, in different situations with excellent results. We know this is a nourishing, supportive education for children, and we know that it works. So there's a real security in that. So coming back again, what is Waldorf education, and what can you expect? As a very short statement, Waldorf education really is built on a core picture of the human being as a developing individual. It is practiced out of some essential principles, such as that the arts matter and that education itself needs to be an art. It has a body of practice that's been built up over 95 years. It is worldwide. It has spread to every continent except for Antarctica, and has flourished in a very, very wide range of different conditions. It has a mandate that the teacher, your children's teacher, must be an active researcher, must be really interested in who those children are and what they need, must be interested in developing her or his own capacities, and must be a learner. So the teacher needs to be looking at the children, the setting, and the time, and meeting those needs. So above all else, Waldorf education is a very lively process. And you feel that life when you walk in to the school. There's a certain calmness, but there's also this life, as if the yeast is at work and the bread is rising. And the results over time are really quite wonderful. So that begins to address a big question of what is Waldorf education. We could have taken it a different way, looking in more detail at the curriculum. But I think for us, for you, as you go into this new venture, this core picture is actually what's really important. Because the thing I have loved about my however long in Waldorf education is the thing I loved when I first encountered it. I was not, even though I was a trained teacher, I was not going to be a teacher. But when I encountered the Waldorf curriculum and the way I saw it meeting children, there was just this sense inside of me, this makes sense. And overall, this makes sense. This works for children, it's life-giving. And it works for parents. So I really encourage you all, beginning with a Q&A session now, to be in dialogue as the questions come up. And as you need to find new answers to what is in front of you. It's a wonderful opportunity. And again, you have a body of practice that's been established right here to build on, and now to address some new questions. So that's the beginning of what is Waldorf education. And now let's see what questions are living in here. Yes.
Well, Liz, I have to say you just did an amazing job. You covered a lot of territory.
Maybe too much, but we need it all there. So
well spoken. I would love if you would speak a little bit more about the parents' role. You spoke about the social education and just a little bit more, because I think that's very exciting for a lot of parents.
Yeah. Well, what are we missing in modern society for many of us is often a feeling of belonging, of community, of a home. And schools are one place where that can develop. Fundamentally, there's a picture, I don't remember who first gave it, of Waldorf education as being a three-legged stool. The child, the teacher, and the parent. And if one of those stools is not stable, it's hard to have it's hard to sit on it. So there are a bunch of things there. Most, and I'm sure this will be true, most Waldorf schools actually ask in an interesting way a lot from their parents, and in an interesting way not much. It's not a parent cooperative. And yet there is this need to be in dialogue, and I think that will be particularly true. So parent education, feeling able to ask the questions as they come up. Parent conferences, so I know as a parent that my child is seen and respected. Respect from the teacher, respect from the teacher that at the end of the day, this is your child. And you are making choices about your child. And yet let's be in dialogue, and I would like to share with you what I know and believe to be true about what's healthy for children. And let's talk about it. The worst thing you want to develop, I have seen in some schools, is where you have, and I think it's much less common now, we've got the answer, we're the experts, pick them up at the end of the year. I mean, not quite that, but there's a dialogue process that actually parents now demand, doesn't matter what the setting is. But so this mutual respect of I as a parent will support the school, I want to understand what I'm getting into. And so, okay, I know at some point there'll probably be discussion about what's good for children in their lives and what's not. One of the things that will probably come up early is, when do we introduce computers? How come there aren't computers in the kindergarten and in the first grade? What do we do about media? Are we going to have some community agreements? Why? And do I buy it? And if I don't buy it, do I feel free to dialogue in order to get to a point where I can feel integrity in this situation? Because that's what my child is going to feel. You don't want to say, well, keep it out there and don't talk about it here. There's got to be a dialogue and a feeling of mutual respect. And that requires education for most parents, but education remembering that we're all adults together, and a willingness, you're making an alternative choice. I used to puzzle about this in the independent schools, where parents would be paying a lot of money and then basically undoing the work of the classroom every night. So, you've got to find, does this resonate with my values? Something is pulling me here or has pulled me here. And how do I support it and yet remember I'm the adult in the situation? I don't know whether that's helpful, but I think it's a dialogue. And then, of course, the school is a wonderful opportunity for community events. And so we start to develop relationships, friends for life often. Yeah.
In regards to core
Yes.
competencies, in the past few years, have you seen success through Waldorf meeting new requirements of charter schools?
It's a good question. Right now there's only one fully public Waldorf school in the country. There are many charters. There are dependent and independent charters depending on the state. There's one school that has a long history in Sacramento, and there's a research study just starting there to really put some concrete form around it. But what they've seen is that through the lower grades, the test results are pretty disastrous. I mean, let's be blunt. The third graders look way off compared to the city averages. But wait, there's more. Because by the time they're in 7th and 8th grade, the averages are higher. So they've been around long enough, and there was an extensive study a number of years ago about the California charters, because the Waldorf charter movement is most established in California. And they looked at test results. And that seems to be a standard pattern. So there's some work to do there with developing credibility. And then you do need some pieces of paper that say, well, look, the research shows, because you've got to be able to stay in existence.
How has the state reacted to that? Do they say, okay, well, we really want you to be great third graders. We don't care about 5 or 6. Looking down the road, do they have? They have.
Depends on the. It's actually at the district level. Mm-hmm. The district with the Sacramento school has given them a lot of freedom, because they have consistently had these high results in 7th and 8th grade. They consistently go on to selective high school programs. They are actually sought by some of the selective high school programs because of their creativity, their problem solving, their independence, their responsibility, so they've got a pass for now. They because they're fully public, they get no breaks. There are a couple of charters in districts that have managed to negotiate holding back on some of the lower grades tests. Others are in active dialogue. So I don't think there's any one answer, but the reality is it's something you need to think about, because your third grade tests will probably be lower because of the different approach to academics. And again, you've got to have your parents informed, because that's what will undo you. Is if the parents go, I wasn't expecting this. But if we're all on this journey together and we know it's going to work, that's a different dynamic. So.
Okay, add on one little thing.
Yeah.
how does it affect the children themselves? If you have a Waldorf child who's been in the program for a couple of years, and you throw all this at them, have you seen any effects on how that has affected the kids?
You mean within a Waldorf school where they suddenly encounter testing?
Suddenly have these
Yeah.
new core.
It really depends on the adults. I mean, so much of this depends on whether the adults are stressing about it. Responsibly, coming back to this question of accountability, you've got to prepare them enough that they know what to do. Now that is a different question now because of computer-based testing. Knowing what to do has suddenly changed. And no one knows what to do about that right now. It's not just Waldorf charter schools. So we're all going to learn a lot within the next 18 months. But you know, again, talking to the principal of this one particular school, she said, we just don't make a big deal out of it. We pull the tests out on test day, and the youngest children fill in pretty patterns with their dots. And then they go out to play. And her attitude is, you know, and they'll do the same with a keyboard.
Right.
But she has the confidence of not having to worry because she knows the district is not going to be on her.
Right.
And so I think there needs to be an ongoing dialogue, and it needs to be research-based because that's what speaks. So I believe you've been very smart in how you've written your charter, and you've got some time. And during that time, the kinks in the Common Core will start to work themselves out. Yeah. But it's an issue. It's an issue, but it's an issue. Teachers feel so oppressed by the current regime of testing. It takes up it has taken up more and more of irreplaceable instructional time to prepare children for tests. And so, you know, at a certain point, it's actually going to be the teachers and the parents who stop it. There was a test case in, I think it was in Oregon or Washington, as we went into last summer, where a group of teachers said, we're not doing it. And I don't know who caved because it went off the radar screen. I'd like to find out. But you know, with this group of professionals who said, we can't stand by this anymore. And it's a huge industry. So there's a balance there because the accountability is real and necessary. You know, this is a publicly funded enterprise. So there has to be accountability. But it's interesting that we don't look to the experts in pedagogy for assessing pedagogy. So we've kind of painted ourselves into a bit of a corner, I think. And it will have to be an ongoing dialogue. And younger children will probably make pretty patterns. So, but you know, why should a young child have test anxiety as part of their educational experience? So, yeah.
You said that all teachers have to be active researchers. What does that exactly mean? Is that like publish or perish with first grade teachers?
Yeah, I want to see that article with, you know, all those pictures. And the first piece of active research is really this mandate for self-development. And so a Waldorf teacher is really asked to, and I call this research, to reflect on their daily activity. To actually take time. I mean, what a wonderfully reassuring thing for a parent to know that my child's teacher takes time every night to reflect on my child's day. Yeah? That right there is a gift. So part of that research is the willingness to engage in developing my own capacities of thinking, of concentration, of imagination, of encountering new learning. I mean, the first time I had to, you know, those chalkboard drawings? First time I had to do one of those, I cried. It seemed like a very logical response to a blank chalkboard. You know, I couldn't draw. I didn't think I could draw. I had to figure it out. And so developing the capacities, mastering the curriculum, being willing to stick with a child who is really getting under your skin and asking the question, what is going on here? What is this child asking of me? I think teachers are researching all the time. All the time. I mean, you lock any adult in a room with 24 or 30 8-year-olds. You're doing research. But as a society, we're not necessarily valuing it. So it's not that necessarily that published research, although I think we could, as a Waldorf movement, we could be doing more of that because so much is happening in the classrooms. But that ability to self-reflect, the willingness to stick with the unknown with a child, the asking for help, that to me is active research that I think all teachers actually do engage in. But then you've got to be allowed to bring the results into the classroom. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment, not a question. I've just had an experience where some friends have come back from Africa, and they got a chance to visit a small village. Not only were they were the first white people to ever go into the village,
Wow.
which is pretty extraordinary in this day and age, but they got a chance to visit in the community. And one of the facts of village life is that there is no education. None of the children in the village go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And it got me to thinking about, worldwide, how big a population is it that never gets a chance to go to school? And, in this country, we take it as a right, not as a privilege, but really as a right that we get to go to school. And here we are in this room tonight, not only with the idea that our children get to go to school, but we have a choice of what kind of school they want to go to. And, I'm not a parent, I am a parent, but I don't have someone going to this school, but I'm a community member. And I look at the fact that we have a choice, that we have this fabulous school that's going to be started in our community as a blessing.
Yeah.
Absolute blessing for our children and for our community. And I've just been thinking to myself, and I wanted to share it with you, given that we have this blessing, how can each of us honor the blessing? And we'll all do it in different ways because we're different people. But I would just like to put it out to you that really this is a blessing, and if we can all set about honoring that blessing in some way, we'll have the best school possible.
Nice. Yes.
I'm curious, I know you have a lot of experience helping kind of get charters off the ground and knowing that teachers need to be both state certified and then Waldorf certified, and lots of times I imagine you don't, imagine that you have teachers that come in that aren't fully certified. What has your experience been with that, and how does that, do those new schools then have mentors that are on site, or just the ongoing teacher education, and how are those experiences with those teachers that maybe aren't fully certified in teaching Waldorf?
That's a great question because it's facing, I think, all of the charters. And truthfully, it can also be true in the independent schools. Some smart things have been done here because there's a commitment to professional development and training, education for teachers. And that really is important because I think the other thing with Waldorf teaching, in my experience, is that you're never done. So that research and ongoing learning is the whole way through because the children change, times change. this school will be forming its own culture, and that will be all of you. It'll be the trained teachers, it'll be the people you bring in, it'll be the teachers who are in training, it'll be the people that come in to have a look and give some help and guidance. There's an outside pair of eyes can be really invaluable, with just some sort of course correcting and suggestions. But then you come down to this, if we all accept a few core principles and we accept that we're working together, I think there'll be a lot of cross-fertilization. You've got to have some people who have some of the knowledge. But we're all at different stages of that, and somehow it works out. And the other thing I think we often forget is that children are incredible teachers of adults. And so for a teacher, that group of children also help the teacher figure out, you can't just put someone who has never taught before or doesn't know what they're doing in a room full of teachers and say, children, and say, well, they'll teach the teacher. But there is a certain, it's not a one-way process. I don't know whether that makes sense. But there's, from what I understand, there's a commitment to training. So you'll have this feeling of a cohort of teachers working and supporting one another, which is one of the best ways of developing as a professional in education. There are huge resources available now that were just not there 20 years ago, which I think is another reason why the charters have been able to develop like this. And there are lots of people who want to help this kind of venture, who are really committed to this idea of this blessing being available to more children. So it'll find its way. Yeah.
Would you be willing to speak a bit about your dissertation?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I've actually been asking this question, what is Waldorf education, ever since I got into it. I've asked it with different intonations at different times. What is Waldorf? But really, my question actually relates a little bit to your question of how do we know what's essential? There's something that's not always definable that makes Waldorf education Waldorf education. So I did a research project with a group of 12th graders and really tried to find out, it's good background noise, don't worry about it. It's another blessing. So I wanted to know what 12th graders, knowing that they were 18, that they were not through this third developmental stage, that they were still, teenagers, but I wanted to know what their experience was. And so I worked with them over time, and what was really interesting was that they had this picture of what is a Waldorf teacher and what is not, that was not always necessarily related to training. But some of the things that they really identified were respect. So teachers that had this respect for them, and I think that's no matter the size of the child, who had a sense of meaning. So meaningfulness was really important. And that's been for me one of the gifts of Waldorf education, is this integrity of meaning. You can say why you're doing things. There's a reason. They really talked about what I would call the invisible curriculum of values, of care, of the arts, of their developing thinking, of the teachers who respected their questions. But this overall feeling of, I want to have a teacher who stands in front of me believing in what they're doing there. And I can't, as an 18-year-old, quite put my finger on what that is. But I get the sense there's something that stands behind this. And that's what's made the difference to me. So just as a little snapshot, they were remarkably articulate. And it was, again, very interesting to talk to the ones who'd come in well through the journey, and because they were comparing in a different way. But, yeah. Yeah.
You spoke about how through the phases somebody might test lower in core competencies until they get to 7th or 8th grade, I think you said.
By 6th, 7th, and 8th, they're starting to really pull ahead. Yeah.
So I have this concern, and I'm hoping you'll just take a minute and speak to it. Right now, the charter school is set for K through 5.
Yes.
What is your thought on a second grader, say, or anybody with an older child entering that may be interrupted before if they make it through 5th grade and we've not yet reached middle school? Have you had that experience?
Yeah. Children come in and out of schools all the time, and they'll be fine. They'll be fine even in 1st and 2nd grade. There'll be an adjustment because it'll be a different kind of work. But 4th and 5th grade, no problem. I think I can say that with a lot of confidence. Because they are learning, it's one of these trite throwaways, but they're learning how to learn. And so there's a flexibility and an adaptability in that. And children who come into a Waldorf environment often have not done as much writing, and they almost always have not done as much art. So there's a period of adjusting of how do you do that? Children who go out of Waldorf into a more traditional environment will encounter things they haven't done or haven't done as much of. And they will also have a period of adjustment of how do you do that? But that's part of learning. And the adjustment is usually really quick. So I really don't think you need to worry. But that's one of those how will it work, how will it turn out questions that is important. But they come and go pretty easily, actually. So yeah, and certainly through 5th grade they'll be fine. They'll be fine, and you'll have planted some capacities that will and seeds that will continue to flower. So yeah.
The public schools have a system of retention, which has been pretty well eradicated with social promotion. How does Waldorf deal with those situations?
I would like to say individually that your real question is what is this child needing? It's not always that simple. It's not always that simple. But is this what I'm seeing, and maybe I don't even quite know what I'm seeing, something that is going to be helped by just time, or do we need to carry this child and provide a different kind of support? They're two very different paths. And so I don't think there's a simple answer to that one. Yeah. But I would like to be able to say it's really based on individual needs. I'm not sure it's quite that simple, though. Yeah. Well, we said 8 o'clock. I'm seeing it's close to 8. I think it's 7, actually. I think it's 6 with the clocks going forward, but this cruel torture they play on us every spring. I would like to finish with this picture of blessing. Because this is a birth. It's a new beginning. It's coming from some very fertile ground, so it's not springing up completely in isolation. And yet what an amazing opportunity that you all have to create this impulse that is going to really impact children's lives. And as you said, a school impacts a community, so that the impact of a school goes out further. I would also say, I spoke at the beginning about, we often come towards this either because we know something about it and it's what we believe in, or we're going from something we don't like. I do also want to emphasize the importance of partnership in education, and that we're all asking these questions, I think. There's so much good work done in classrooms across the country. And we're all really asking, how can we best meet the needs of children? The wonderful thing about charters is that they have opened up possibilities. And you have decided to walk through this door called Waldorf. That's the possibility, the choice that you are grabbing. And I'm completely biased. I've been a Waldorf parent, I've been a Waldorf teacher, I've been a Waldorf school administrator, I've been a board member, I've done all of these different things in Waldorf. I've taught Waldorf teachers. I never grow tired of looking at this education and of going into the schools and witnessing what is happening in classrooms. It's wonderful. And to watch children relax into learning and their curiosity and their interest and questions. And the longer we can keep those sparks, those flames intact, the healthier those children are going to be and the more impact they're going to have on beyond school. So that to me is the beauty of this, of these core principles. You know, that we take a little one like this and we really look, what are you going to need? And how do we help you grow into who you came here to be? So I really wish you a lot of joy as this comes into form. I mean, I know a lot of heavy lifting is being done. And I'm looking forward to coming back when it's on the ground and to looking to see what you're building together in partnership. It's very exciting. So blessings on your blessing is what I would say.